Welcome to the track we're calling the history of sabermetrics. And in this first segment, I want to talk about one of the key figures in sabermetrics history, which is Henry Chadwick. Now, this is a page from the book written by Henry Chadwick called How to Play Baseball. And so I scanned this page from a digital copy online. So there's Henry Chadwick, and he's widely known as the father of baseball. You can see that here on the book that he himself wrote. So at the time, he was known as the father of baseball. Henry Chadwick was a writer, and Henry Chadwick was a pioneer, certainly in scorekeeping, keeping the record of the games of baseball that he observed. But he also was very crucial in keeping the rules straight, keeping the rules recorded and refined for the game of baseball. He really was a champion of the game. In the early part of his career, though, Chadwick was a writer for the New York newspapers about cricket, the game of cricket, and he was a fan and a player. And that was his background. He came from England, moved here when his father moved here when he was 13 years old and moved to Brooklyn, and continued his fascination with the game of cricket when he became a writer later in his career. But then in 1856, everything changed. He started noticing more people playing the game of baseball. And that led to his lifelong fascination with the game and led to the title that he sort of received as the father of baseball. Now, he was so prominent and important to the game that he was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1938. And the plaque reads in the Hall of Fame, baseball's preeminent pioneer writer for half a century, inventor of the box score, author of the first rule book in 1858, chairman of the Rules Committee in first nationwide baseball organization. So those are his key contributions. A pioneer writer, he was one of the original writers, not the first, but one of the first. They say here that he was the inventor of the box score, and that's fairly controversial. And we'll talk about that soon in the next slide. But his pioneering efforts were in the rules and in popularizing the game, writing about the game. That was crucial. He also, as you'll see, was a record keeper, a scorekeeper. Because he came from cricket, and as a fan of cricket, he was a key record keeper there. He decided to keep the record of the baseball games just as well. So here is actually the first box score ever published. The first box score ever published here was in 1845. Now, it was published in the New York Herald on October 25th. This baseball game between the Brooklyn Ball Club and the New York Ball Club, took place on October 24th. But notice the date. This is before Chadwick takes an interest in the game of baseball. What they record in this really crude box score are hands out. Now, hands out here, for each of the players on each of the teams, the hands out records the outs made by each of these players. So if they were put out as they batted the ball, or they were struck out, or they were tagged out on the base paths as a runner, it was recorded here in the hands out column. Otherwise, they scored a run. So they just recorded the two crucial things that were components of the game, the runs each of the players scored, and they were totaled here for each of the teams. Now, as we know, that's the outcome of the game. So the New York Ball Club wins this game 37 runs to 19 runs. So that's what this original box score recorded. They didn't do a lot more recording of other information. And Chadwick himself would have been familiar with these box scores. Reporting on cricket, he would have noticed that the newspapers also reported in this fashion, in this kind of box score fashion, on the game of baseball. But then again, remember, 1856 is a key moment. That's when he starts to watch the game and pay attention to the game of baseball. Chadwick turns from cricket towards baseball in 1856. And he describes it as being a seminal moment in his career. A direct quote from him was that the game was being sharply played on both sides, and he watched it with a, quote, deeper interest than any previous baseball match he had seen. And one of the key things he realized was that this game might become the American game. And just like cricket was the game of England, he thought the game of baseball could become the American game. Now, I think it's hard to overstate the importance of Chadwick's shift in his career towards baseball, the importance of this moment in 1856. He really does change the arc of the game through his efforts over the next 4 or 5 decades, where he really promotes the game and writes about it and refines the rules. But let's talk about his scorekeeping efforts. Before we shift to the next slide, I want to point out that there are 2 interesting things about this box score itself. Maybe this could be part of the discussion board, who can figure out some interesting facts here about this box score. But let's talk about the scorekeeping efforts of Henry Chadwick. This is his original score sheet that he settled on here. And he publishes this score sheet in a book he wrote called Chadwick's Baseball Manual. He published this in 1874 after attending a conference in Boston, where he describes more thoroughly to fans of the game, different ways to keep the record, different ways to score the game. So let's go through this score sheet pretty quickly. This is one side of a score sheet. Just like modern score sheets, there's 2 sides based on which team is on offense and which team is on defense. And on this side of the score sheet, we record what happens to the offensive team. You list the offensive batsmen in their lineup order here. This section is where you actually record the events of each at-bat of all the offensive players. So batsman 1 would come up in the first inning and record the outcome of that at-bat here. You'd also list, though, the defense on this score sheet. So let's review what all these columns mean here. The good plays in field. What essentially you're recording in each of these columns are the different kinds of outs made by each of the defensive fielders. So the first column here is position. So you'd list here second base, shortstop, third base for each of the fielders, what position they played. The second column is what Chadwick calls out on base. And essentially, this is when you would make a putout as a fielder. So a fielder would make a putout, and you can imagine that even back then, the first baseman would have a lot of putouts and a lot of marks in this column. So this is the putouts column. What was recorded separately, though, but these were infielders. Okay, so this is like the first, second, third, shortstop, outs on base in the infield. What we have in this column is fair fly outs. So these would be outs caught in the air by all the different fielders. So fair fly outs. And that's distinguished from foul fly outs in column L. What's different here that we don't see anymore, that the rules changed about a decade later. In column D, you would mark outs made by foul bounds. And bound is essentially a grounder. And a grounder is defined as being a ball hit into the area of the infield. So if a ball hit sort of on the infield, but was a foul ball, was fielded by a fielder, that would have been an out. That would have been called a foul bound out. K is the familiar strikeout of today. It was used even back then. So you'd record mostly strikeouts here, and this would be mostly the catcher, whatever fielder it was. But if they switched around, another player would get credit for that. And R is a tag out, a put out by tagging. So this is sort of the, base runner being put out. T is the total. So this mark here would be the sum total of all these data points here for each game. And this is the familiar assist column, and Chadwick called it assistance. So anytime a fielder would make assistance on another player's good play in field, they're out recorded, they'd get marked here. And then there'd be the sum total at the bottom here. You'd record everybody's on the field, in the game, you'd record all the different good plays in field by the fielders. Now on this side, over here of the score sheet, you'd record the information of each of the batsmen, the offensive information of each of the batsmen. And going in the opposite direction, here's the key one. This is runs scored. This is the number of runs scored. This is not RBIs. This is runs scored by each of the batsmen. And coming from cricket scorekeeping, that's the key data point from cricket and the key data point recorded in the earliest forms of box scores and scorekeeping in baseball itself. These are the number of outs made. Even these two columns are remnants of the early crude box scores. These are all outs made by each of the batsmen. But this starts recording the hits. These are all hits. This is total hits. This is total bases. So for a single, double, triple home run, they'd be weighted 1, 2, 3, and 4, just like total bases are today. So you'd mark here, you'd mark in each of these, you'd put little dots here. If 4 dots would register a home run when you did the scorekeeping. Okay, and then you just mark 1 here for base hit. If with this batsman here hit a home run. Now this is reaching base on error, and this is M for muffs. They called them muffs back in the day, not errors. So if they reached base, if the batsman reached base on a muff from a fielder, they'd get marked here. And the next one here, the next column here is reaching base on a walk. Interesting, as we consider the value of walks today by batsmen, it was actually considered a base on error back then. In other words, a mistake by the pitcher to allow the batter, the batsman, to get on base on balls by a walk. Now finally, if the batsman was left on base as a runner, it was marked here. So you could, this is a thing recorded still today, how many batsmen were left on base. And finally, this is the interesting column. This is not often happening in this time, but this is the home run column. Anytime a home run was hit, it would be marked here. You'd mark a home run here. And these home runs were defined as, strong hits, not muffed, past the outfielders, the people not in the infield. So this is really recording big home runs. And this is what Chadwick set up, and this is what Chadwick taught people on how to score the game. So this is the original sort of Chadwick score sheet that started record keeping through the 19th century baseball. Since this segment's getting a little long, and we have more to talk about with Henry Chadwick, I thought I'd break it up here. So please do the assessment following this video and then move on to the part 2 of Henry Chadwick in the history of sabermetrics.